All right, good morning. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here today. I got two briefs for my presentation today. One was from Brandon to talk about change and BLM, and the other was a request because of the really diverse audience that I understand that we have to talk a little bit more about the history of BLM. And so what I'd like to do is think about what aspects of rangeland are variable and changing. And for us right now, for BLM, that's everything. That's the Bureau itself, that's the staff, that's the partners that we work with, that's the land that we manage and the nature and the type of the change agents that are on that land and affecting that land. And that's also the science and technology that we need in order to be effective. And particularly thinking about needing to manage more and more on a landscape level, and that we need the tools that will allow us to do that. As a part of looking at the history of the Bureau, I'd like to point out that the Bureau of Land Management goes back to the foundations of the United States of America. It started on the East Coast of North America after the Revolutionary War, when the 13 original states ceded the land that they had all received through different mechanisms, but there were 237 million acres that were ceded to the American government at that point, and they trickled in between 1781 and 1802. So by 1812, the US government set up something called the General Land Office that we'll talk about in a minute. And that period of big acquisition of land ended in 1867 with the purchase of Alaska from Russia through treaty. I put the map here of the acquisitions in the lower 48 and Alaska, so you can look at it and see that the distribution of where those acquisitions are has a big impact on the way that we manage today, because who the tribes were on the ground mattered in the way that they interacted with the landscape, but also who the Europeans were that came in mattered. The Spanish in this area had a very different approach, a more colonial approach to the way that they managed the landscapes than did the Russians, who were more traders and trappers. The French also had a different impact, and that plays out in the way that land is platted today, and also in the historic landscapes that we're working with. So BLM has changed over the time, or the organization that BLM is today has changed over the time. As I mentioned, the General Land Office was established in 1812. Its primary role was to develop the public land survey system and to survey the West so that it could be disposed of. And so if you look at all of the areas of this map that are shaded in blue, those were areas that were covered by the public land survey system. There were other ways of allocating the land in other areas. The grazing service was established in 1934. This is during the Dust Bowl, and it was part of the effort to better manage the landscape that we had and manage for long run productivity on the lands. And BLM wasn't founded until 1946 as an organization. It was a combination of both the General Land Office and the Grazing Service. We were originally organized around regional offices that had both grazing districts and forestry. That changed really pretty quickly to more of a state-based organization, where now we have what are called state offices that tend to be responsible for land management that is pretty closely aligned along state lines. There are exceptions. For example, the New Mexico office manages our interests in Texas and Oklahoma. The Nevada office manages the California, a grazing district in the top of Nevada, of California, that I'm just blanking out on right now. So there are exceptions, but for the most part, we closely align with state lines. The purposes of public land have also changed, and the perception of those purposes have changed through time. Up until 1934, it was really assumed that public lands would be disposed of as quickly as possible. And there were a lot of tools that were used for that. Scrip was given to soldiers after wars, giving them acreage. The Homestead Act was responsible for it, the Desert Lands Act, Timber Culture Act. There were a lot of tools that were used with the idea that land would be disposed of. And there were usually some requirements for proving up on that land. So if you look at a state like Nevada right now, which is currently 87% BLM, The reason it's still 87% BLM is it was hard to prove up on a lot of that land. The land that's got water on it is what's private now. The rest of it is more uplands. When we get into the late 1890s, things start to change. We get more of an interest in trains and railroads. Were interested in being able to take people to recreational opportunities like Yellowstone National, what became Yellowstone National Park. We start seeing the impacts of the Civil War that were mentioned earlier today, over logging and forestry in order to support the war effort, but also to build all those railroad ties for all those railroads, was starting to lead to some huge flood events following precipitation. And so there was an increased focus on reserving federal lands for certain purposes. Some of it went to the Forest Service, primarily for water. I assume, I don't know what's underneath the Jornada, but there's a good chance it was public domain at one point in time. I went to wildlife refuges, the Department of Defense, National Park Services, things like that. We came in 1934 to the Taylor Grazing Act and into a period of primarily custodial management of the public domain. This was a point where the grazing districts and the forestry offices at the ground level were primarily responsible for project-based management just in the area where they worked. Intensive management really started to pick up more in the 1950s. This is an era when the Bureau was doing a lot of projects, big chainings up in the Great Basin, big seeding efforts, shrub removal for when we have woody encroachment. In 1976, the Federal Public Land Management Act, or FLPMA, was put into place, and that moved the BLM into a multiple use and sustained yield organization. So that unless it's set aside specifically for conservation purposes, public domain is managed on the basis of multiple use and sustained yield. And we have, in fact, our Congress has set aside some acreage for conservation purposes. The National Landscape Conservation System was established in 2000 specifically to conserve, protect, and restore nationally significant landscapes. So if you take a look at the map here, you'll see, first of all, that there's a big cluster of orange, both in west of the Mississippi and up in Alaska. And that really reflects the settlement patterns across the US. And so those are the lands that are retained as public domain right now. There's about 245 million acres of them, and 210 of them are managed for multiple use and sustained yield, but Congress has set aside approximately 35 million acres in 900 units for conservation purposes. One thing that a lot of folks don't know about the BLM is that we also manage the federal mineral estate. So for example, when people were homesteading, a lot of times they were given the rights to the surface land, but not to the subsurface. It's that subsurface that is the federal mineral estate. There's about 700 million acres. And so the BLM manages that no matter who has the surface. BLM now is responsible for, it's a huge economic driver for the nation. We annually put out this report, A Sound Investment for America. And it's always a year or two behind, but in fiscal year 2020, we had $125 billion in economic output associated with public domain, and that includes all kinds of things. It's oil and gas at 71.0 billion, it's coal, it's non-mineral energies. Increasingly, it's renewable energy and recreation. So it's definitely changing through time. And there are a lot of other benefits that come from these positions. And so it's a good report, it's worth looking at, and it's a reflection of how people's perception of the landscape is changing. There are other aspects of change right now. The disturbances that we have in the ecosystems, fire, invasives, drought, dust are just examples. The kinds of land uses that people want, conventional and renewable energy production, you often hear about that, but you hear less about the conflicts that come with the different choices in energy production. Development, e-bikes and other types of dispersed recreational use. Over the last couple of years, our public land users have really climbed. We've got more and more people who are actually living on public land. So these are all things to think about. And how people perceive that actual and projected ecological transformation is incredibly important. Those changes have ripple effects that you might not think about. So most of the fires on DOI managed lands are shrubland and grassland fires, and so most of them are on BLM land. That's having huge effects. For example, for years, we've used fire crews at the end of the fire season to mix our seed and put seed on the ground for seeding projects. Well, that doesn't work anymore because our fire crews are still on fires. That ripples out into the community. People are dealing with smoke all the time. We need to have conversations about whether or not a fuels treatment is better than a wildland fire. It ripples into bureau staffing. We need more recreational specialists. We need more people who are capable of analyzing data that's being produced. And we're increasingly moving from project level management to landscape level and multi-scale management. This diagram looks pretty similar to something that Sherry showed earlier, but I'd like to walk you around this wheel when we think about our land management. We all have some perceived need or goal for the land that we're working on. We need to assess that. We need to think about our partners. And for BLM, because our land management responsibilities are often highly interspersed with those around us, we really must work in a partnership. We can't work on our own, even in Nevada, because other folks have all the water. So we have to work in partnerships. We need to run all of those assessments and strategies through whatever our planning processes are. And so for BLM, the way we plan is that we plan at a local level in something called a land use management plan, which is where we're able to talk about what does multiple use and sustained yield mean here in this place with these people and these systems. And then we'll do project level planning before that, which is where we might propose a grazing permit, or we might talk about a seeding project or a forestry project or something like that. Those are all permitted or planned and then implemented. And then there's the monitoring for adaptive management. So I think that's a wheel that everyone's got some familiarity with. What I'd like to add is that happens at all scales. It really needs to. We have these conversations at the national level. There's a lot of conversation right now about where is the nationally consistent science? Where are the nationally consistent management objectives? That happens at the regional scale and then steps down to local also. So over the last 30 years in particular, BLM's been working on developing the tools to help us. One strategy that we've worked with very closely, especially with ARS here at the Jornada, is the development of the assessment, inventory, and monitoring strategy. We've also needed to then figure out how to work with our partners and share that information. And so recently we've moved from what was a landscape approach data portal to this new BLM geospatial business platform, which is where you can publicly get some of the data that I just shared, for example, the AIM data. Which brings us down to our fundamental question right now facing us that needs to be talked about, and that's what does it mean to manage for sustained yield in a non-stationary environment where everything's changing. That matters for us because we use land health, which is based on ecological processes, essentially as our measuring stick. And as Joel will know better than I do, the calculations for ecological site descriptions are based sometimes on our understanding of what will happen. And if we don't know what's going to happen, it makes that calculus a little bit more complicated. So it means we're really definitely skating on a thin ice situation where we need to continue to work hand in glove with the research community, come up with science and tools that we can use not only for evaluating land health, but also to inform our current decisions. We turn those assessments of land health, we develop local standards, and these standards are developed in coordination with resource advisory councils, which are locally based. So these are incredibly important and again, matter for the way that we manage. Those fundamentals or those standards right now are based on 4 fundamentals, which look at watersheds, ecological processes, water quality, and habitats. And so incredibly important and all changing. Perfect. Look at that. We're on the last slide. We hit the So foundational questions, what does it mean? That leads us to a couple of other issues, the ecological site classifications and descriptions. How do we develop standards for systems that are not based on ecological site descriptions as public land users are changing? And how do we set benchmarks for indicators that vary appropriately? So I'd like to end with that. Things are changing and so is BLM. Thank you.